I am your host, Nero Wolfe. Let's begin our journey.
I was in the office, nursing a glass of milk and wondering if the humidity in the orchid rooms was making Wolfe's temper damp or more combustible, when the doorbell rang. It was 10:14 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, and Manhattan was currently wrapped in a grey fog that made the brownstone feel like an island in a very dreary sea. Wolfe was behind his desk, occupied with a book on the irrigation systems of ancient Mesopotamia. He didn't even look up when the bell echoed through the hallway. To Wolfe, a ringing doorbell is not an invitation. It is a rude interruption by a world that refuses to mind its own business. I went to the front door, checked the one-way glass, and saw a man who looked like he'd been pressed between the pages of a dictionary and left to dry for 50 years. He was wearing a tweed coat that had seen better decades, and was clutching a leather portfolio as if it contained the secret to eternal life. He looked harmless, but in my experience, the ones who look like they'd apologize to a moth are often the ones carrying the most interesting trouble. I opened the door. "Good morning. If you're representing a charitable organization, Mr. Wolfe has already met his quota for the month." "I am Arthur Pendergast," the man said, his voice sounding like dry parchment rubbing together. "I am the senior appraiser for Sterling Sons. I need to see Mr. Wolfe. It is a matter of absolute discretion." I led him into the office. Wolfe didn't look up until Pendergast was standing directly in front of his desk. Wolfe marked his place in his book with a thin strip of gold-embossed leather and sighed. It was a long, theatrical sigh that signaled the end of his piece. "Mr. Pendergast," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble, "you are agitated." "Agitation is a waste of metabolic energy. Why are you in my office?" "Mr. Wolfe," Pendergast began, his hands trembling slightly as he placed the portfolio on the edge of the desk. "A disaster has occurred. Last night, during a private viewing of the Weymouth collection, a theft was committed. Not of a book, but of a single, irreplaceable leaf from the 1455 Gutenberg Bible. It was replaced by a facsimile so perfect it nearly passed my own inspection. If this becomes public, Sterling Sons is finished. The auction is in 3 days. We have 4 suspects, all of whom were in the room, and none of whom could have possibly done it." Wolfe shifted his weight, the chair groaning in sympathy. "A theft of paper, commonplace. Why bring it to me?" "Because the thief didn't just take the page," Pendergast said, leaning in. "They took the only copy of the Weymouth Provenance papers that prove the Bible's history back to the 17th century. Without them, the book is legally radioactive. I need someone who can see through the smoke without calling a fire brigade." Wolfe's eyes remained half-closed. I knew that look. He wasn't interested in Pendergast's reputation, but he was interested in the forgery. Wolfe has a profound distaste for things that pretend to be what they aren't. "Mr. Goodwin," Wolfe said, looking at me, "does Sterling Sons still maintain that absurdly high-quality collection of 16th-century culinary manuscripts?" "I believe they do," I said, "right next to Gutenberg and the internal traitors." Wolfe turned back to Pendergast. "I will require a retainer of $3,000, and I will require Archie to have unfettered access to your gallery. If you want me to find a ghost in a library, you must allow me to disturb the dust." Pendergast reached for his checkbook with a hand that was finally starting to stop shaking. I caught Wolfe's eye. He wasn't looking at the check, he was looking at the spot on the wall where he usually stares when he's calculating how many rules he's going to have to break. The sanctity of the brownstone had officially been compromised by a man who lived among the dead. I ushered Pendergast back to the door once the paperwork was signed. As I watched him walk down the steps, I noticed a black sedan idling across the street. It wasn't a taxi, and it wasn't a van. It was just a car with tinted windows watching the house. I closed the door and went back to the office. "We have company across the street, Wolfe," I said, "and I have a feeling Mr. Pendergast isn't the only one interested in that Bible leaf. Are we really taking this on?" "It's a lot of legwork for some old paper." Wolfe didn't look up as he reopened his book. "It is not old paper, Archie. It is an intellectual trespass. And since Mr. Pendergast has seen fit to bring his anxiety into my office, I expect you to bring me the names of those who believe they can outsmart a dead printer. Go and get your hat. I want to know who at Sterling Sons has suddenly developed a taste for expensive hobbies." I headed for the hall. The game was on, and the brownstone felt smaller than it had an hour ago. The silence was gone, replaced by the invisible ticking of a clock I didn't yet understand. I didn't even have time to finish my morning coffee before the brownstone started feeling like a crowded waiting room at a bankruptcy court. Arthur Pendergast had barely cleared the front steps when the first wave of the opposition arrived, and they didn't come with the hushed tones usually associated with high-end bibliophilia. It started with the doorbell ringing at 11:15, right as Wolfe was in the middle of his morning session in the plant rooms. When Wolfe is with the orchids, the rest of the world is supposed to stop spinning, but the person on the other side of our front door clearly hadn't read the manual. I went to the door and saw a woman who looked like she had been carved out of a single piece of very expensive, very cold marble. She was wearing a suit that cost more than my first 3 cars combined and was tapping a manicured fingernail against a leather briefcase. Behind her stood a man in a rumpled suit who looked like Head spent the last decade living in a basement and eating nothing but old glue. I opened the door and gave them my most professional were busy look. If you're looking for Mr. Pendergast, he's already gone. If you're looking for Mr. Wolfe, he's currently occupied with a group of Miltonias that don't like to be rushed. They don't take kindly to walk-ins. I am Beatrice Vane, the majority shareholder of Sterling Sons, the woman said, and she moved past me into the hallway without waiting for an invitation. It was a smooth power play, the kind of move that usually works on people who don't spend their lives around Nero Wolfe. And this is Marcus Finch, our lead conservator. We are here to ensure that Mr. Wolfe understands the sensitivity of the matter Mr. Pendergast has so recklessly brought to his doorstep. I led them into the front room, the one we keep for people who aren't quite ready for the inner sanctum of the office. Beatrice Vane didn't sit. She paced the length of the rug, her eyes scanning the bookshelves with a look of profound disapproval. Finch, the conservator, sat on the edge of a chair and started fiddling with his spectacles, looking like he wanted to apologize for existing. He shouldn't have come here, Vane said, her voice echoing into the hallway. Sterling Sons is a private institution. Our scandals are meant to be handled with discretion, not by hiring a private investigator who treats every missing page like a tabloid headline. If word gets out that the Weymouth Gutenberg has been compromised, the auction will be a bloodbath and our reputation will vanish overnight. Then why are you here? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. If you want discretion, coming to the most famous detective in New York seems like a funny way to get it. You might as well hire a brass band to play on the sidewalk. She turned on me, her eyes sharp as a pair of surgical shears. I am here to offer a counter-proposal. I want Mr. Wolfe to return the retainer to Pendergast and step away from this case. We have our own internal security, and Mr. Finch is perfectly capable of identifying the culprit without the drama of a public inquiry. We handle our own laundry. I've already identified the method, Finch muttered, looking at the floor. It was a precision cut. Whoever did it knew exactly how to preserve the vellum. It wasn't a thief, it was a specialist with a steady hand. Be quiet, Marcus, Vane snapped. I decided it was time to move the party. I led them into the office just as the elevator groaned a sign that the great man was descending from the roof. A moment later, Wolfe entered. He saw the 2 strangers in his office, and his expression was that of a man who had just found a caterpillar in his salad. He didn't say a word. He walked to his chair, navigated the difficult process of seating his 1/7 of a ton, and adjusted his desk blotter by a 1/16 of an inch. Archie, Wolfe said, not looking at our guests. Who are these people, and why are they standing on my rug? I thought I gave instructions regarding the preservation of my atmosphere. This is Mrs. Beatrice Vane and Mr. Marcus Finch, I said. Thea from Sterling Sons. They've come to tell us that we're fired before we've even started. They want to buy our ignorance. Vane stepped forward. Mr. Wolfe, I am prepared to double whatever retainer Arthur Pendergast gave you if you will simply agree to drop this matter. It is a question of institutional stability and the sanctity of the market. Wolfe's eyes went shut. They stayed shut for so long I thought he might have actually fallen asleep, but I knew better. He was insulted. Offering Wolfe money to stop working is like offering a cat money to stop chasing a mouse. It doesn't make sense to the biology of the beast. Mrs. Vane, Wolfe said, his voice like a distant storm. I have already accepted a commission. To accept a second commission to thwart the first would be a violation of my own internal logic, which is far more rigid than your board's bylaws. Furthermore, you have entered my home without an invitation and attempted to bribe me into ignorance. I do not like being bribed. It implies that my integrity is an item on a clearance rack, marked down for quick disposal. It isn't a bribe, Finch stammered. It's a settlement for services not rendered. A distinction without a difference, Wolfe snapped. He opened his eyes and leveled a gaze at Finch that made the man visibly shrink. Mr. Finch, you are the conservator. If you are so capable, why did you allow a leaf to be replaced by a facsimile under your very nose? Or was it perhaps your hand that held the blade? Expertise is often the most effective mask for larceny. Finch's face went from pale to a dull, mottled red. He looked at Vane, who was glaring at him with enough heat to melt lead. He didn't answer. I thought so, Wolfe said. He turned his attention back to his desk, picking up a fountain pen. Archie, show them out, and call Saul Panzer. I want him at the Sterling Sun's Gallery by 1 o'clock. If the sanctity of this house is to be disturbed by the frantic denials of the guilty or the terrified, I might as well ensure the disturbance is productive. I will not have my time trifled with. Vane didn't move for a second. She looked at Wolfe, then at me, then at the door. You're making a mistake, Mr. Wolfe. You're playing with a fuse you don't understand. This isn't just about paper. I understand fuses perfectly, Madam, Wolfe said, already unscrewing the cap of his pen. They are designed to lead to an explosion. I merely intend to be standing behind a very thick wall when it happens. Archie, I escorted them to the door. Vane walked out with her head high, but Finch was still clutching that briefcase like it held the secrets of the universe. As I closed the door on them, I saw the black sedan again. It was still idling across the street, its exhaust puffing white in the cold morning air, watching and waiting. I went back into the office and stood in front of Wolfe's desk. We still have company across the street, and I have a feeling Mrs. Vane isn't the type to go home and knit socks. Are we really taking this on? A single page of an old Bible seems like a lot of trouble for a Tuesday. Wolfe didn't look up. We have something better than maps or Bibles, Archie. We have 3 people who are terrified of the same thing for different reasons. That is a much more reliable foundation for an investigation than a corpse. Go and get your coat. You're going to the gallery. I want to know exactly what kind of ink Marcus Finch uses for his restorations. If he can create a facsimile that fools Pendergast, he is a man of significant and perhaps dangerous talent. I headed for the hall, grabbing my hat. The game was on, and the brownstone felt smaller than it had an hour ago, as if the walls were leaning in to hear what we were going to do next. The Sterling Sun's Gallery on Madison Avenue was the kind of place that made you feel like you should apologize for having a pulse. It was all hushed whispers, thick carpets that swallowed your footsteps, and a security system that probably cost more than the gross national product of a small European nation. I parked the Heron a block away and walked through the fog, feeling the heavy gaze of the street-level cameras on my neck. The air inside smelled of beeswax, old vellum, and the sort of high-grade dust that only accumulates around things that haven't been touched since the Renaissance. I was met in the private viewing room by Arthur Pendergast, who looked even more like a dried-up pressed flower than he had in our office. He led me to the center of the room, where a group was gathered around a glass display case that looked empty but was currently housing a multi-million-dollar disaster. It was time to meet the cast of characters, and it was a lineup that would have made a jury reach for the aspirin. Beatrice Vane was there, looking like she was presiding over a funeral for a relative she didn't particularly like. Marcus Finch, the conservator, was huddled over a magnifying lamp at a side table, his hands trembling as he examined a different folio. But there were 2 new faces to add to the collection of headaches Wolfe had sent me to catalogue. The first was a man named Julian Spires. He was young, somewhere in his early 30s, with a haircut that cost more than my weekly salary, and a smile that was a little too bright for a room full of dead books. Pendergast introduced him as the firm's chief development officer, which is a fancy way of saying he was the guy who convinced millionaires to part with their money in exchange for a feeling of cultural superiority. Spires was leaning against a mahogany pillar with an air of practiced nonchalance, but his eyes were moving over the room like a hawk looking for a field mouse. The second addition was a woman named Eleanor Rossi. She was a private collector's representative brought in to verify the Weymouth provenance for an anonymous buyer. She was dark-haired, sharp-eyed, and had a way of looking at you that made you feel like you were a counterfeit she was about to expose. She was sitting with her arms crossed, watching Finch with an expression of pure, unadulterated skepticism. "So," I said, leaning against the doorframe and taking out my notebook, "this is the inner circle. Mr. Pendergast says a leaf of the Gutenberg has been swapped for a high-end fake. I am just curious who had the keys to this room during the private viewing last night." "We all had access at various points," Julian Spires said, his voice a smooth, buttery baritone. "Sterling Sons operates on a system of professional trust. Mr. Goodwin, we aren't a bank vault. We are a repository of history. Locking each other out would be antithetical to our mission. Trust is a great thing until someone uses it to buy a yacht," I said. "And history is fine, but in this town, a single leaf of Gutenberg is a down payment on a penthouse. Mr. Finch, you're the expert on the physical stuff. When did you first notice the switch?" Finch didn't look up from his lamp. The ink was wrong. "The original used a lead-based pigment that has a specific luster under ultraviolet light. The forgery is excellent. It uses aged paper, but the stroke weight is off by a fraction of a millimeter. It was done by someone who knows exactly how to manipulate the fibers. It's not just a copy, it's a tribute." "And the provenance papers?" I asked, looking at Eleanor Rossi. "Pendergast mentioned they were missing too. The papers are the real loss," she said, her accent light but her tone heavy. "They contain the handwritten notes of the Weymouth family, detailing the book's journey through the Napoleonic Wars. Without them, the leaf is just a piece of paper. With them, it is an international treasure. I warned Mr. Pendergast weeks ago that the security here was a joke that isn't funny anymore," Beatrice Vane snapped. "Mr. Goodwin, I have already expressed my desire to have this matter handled internally. Having you prowling around like a beat cop is not helping the market value." "I'm not a beat cop," I said. "I'm a research assistant for a man who doesn't like being lied to. And right now, this room is full of people who are holding their breath. Mr. Spires, you deal with the buyers. Has anyone expressed a specific interest in the Weymouth leaf lately? Maybe a collector with a big checkbook and no conscience?" Spires hesitated for a fraction of a second, kind of hesitation that Wolfe would have pounced on like a tiger. "We have many interested parties. It's a prestigious item, but I don't keep track of their personal agendas." "That's a lie," Julian Pendergast whispered, his voice cracking. "You were the one who suggested we move the Bible to this specific room for the viewing. You were the one who insisted on the new halogen lighting that blinded the overhead cameras for 3 hours during the installation." The room went cold. Spires didn't lose his smile, but it looked like it had been pasted on with the same glue Finch used for his bindings. Rossi looked at Spires with renewed interest, and Beatrice Vane looked like she was about to have a stroke. I walked around the table, taking in the scene. I didn't find the missing page, but I found plenty of motive. Spires needed money to maintain his lifestyle. Finch had the technical skill to make the fakes. Rossi had the knowledge to know what was worth stealing, and Vane had the power to cover it all up to protect the firm's name. I put my notebook away and headed for the exit. I've seen enough for one morning. Mr. Wolfe will want to review these dynamics over his lunch. He'll be back tomorrow to look at those new lights you installed, Mr. Spires, and ID advise nobody to try and leave town. The fog is thick, and Mr. Wolfe has a very long reach. I walked out of the gallery, but I didn't head for the car. I doubled back to the service entrance, making sure I wasn't being followed. I wanted a look at the gallery's trash. As I reached the alley, I saw a familiar black sedan idling near the corner. The driver was a man in a dark hat, his face obscured by the mist. He didn't move as I passed. He was just waiting, like a vulture on a fence, for something to die. I got to the heron and sat there for a moment, the silence of the gallery still ringing in my ears. Wolfe was right, these wasn't about old paper. It was about a group of people who had spent so much time among the dead that they'd forgotten how to be honest with the living. By the time I pulled the heron into the garage and walked the short distance to the brownstone, the fog had turned into a fine, biting drizzle. I let myself in, shook my coat like a wet spaniel in the hallway, and headed straight for the office. It was nearing lunch, which meant Wolfe would be in a state of suspended animation, mentally preparing his palate for whatever masterpiece Fritz was conjuring in the kitchen. I found him at his desk, staring at a small sprig of Cattleya triani he must have brought down from the roof. He didn't look up as I sat at my desk and flipped open my notebook. I gave him the rundown: Spias' expensive smile, Finch shaky hands, Ross's sharp eyes, and the general atmosphere of expensive dread that permeated the gallery. Wolfe listened with his eyes shut, his fingers interlaced over his center of gravity. "And the new lights Mr. Spires was so eager to install?" he asked when I finished. "You mentioned they blinded the cameras." "They're high-intensity LEDs," I said. "Great for showing off gold leaf, and even better for washing out a security feed if you know the angle. Spires is our man for the opportunity, but he doesn't have the hands to slice a page out of a 15th century Bible without leaving a ragged edge. Finch has the hands, but he looks like he's afraid of his own shadow. Rossi has the brains, but she's an outsider. She'd need a partner to get past the primary vault bolt." Wolfe opened one eye. "Partnerships in crime are like marriages, Archie. They begin with a shared goal and end with a dispute over the assets. Go back, not to the gallery, to the places where these people spend their time when they aren't pretending to be scholars. I want to know about Julian Spias Taylor and Marcus Finch, apothecary. A man who shakes as he does can hardly be trusted with a scalpel unless he is being chemically assisted." I didn't argue. Arguing with Wolfe when he's hungry is like trying to debate a landslide. I grabbed my hat and went back out into the drizzle. My first stop was a small, dusty shop in the West Village that specialized in rare bookbinding supplies. The owner was a man who looked like he hadn't seen the sun since the Truman administration. I mentioned Marcus Finch's name, and the man's face soured. "Finch," he muttered, wiping a hand on a stained apron. "He used to be the best, but for the last year he's been buying more than just calfskin and gold leaf. He's been asking for specific solvent stuff that can lift ink without damaging the fiber underneath, and he's been buying it in quantities that suggest he's either cleaning a cathedral or making a lot of mistakes." "Does he pay in cash?" I asked. "Lately, yes, and he doesn't wait for the change." I thanked him and moved on to my next target, Julian Spires. A man with an expensive haircut usually has a paper trail to match. I spent 2 hours visiting the kind of bars where people go to be seen. Eventually, I found a bartender at a place called the Gilded Page who knew Spires well. "Mr. Spires?" "Sure, he's a regular," the bartender said, polishing a glass with practiced boredom. "Always has a roll of bills and a different girl on his arm, but lately he's been looking over his shoulder. He's had a couple of private meetings in the back booth with a guy who doesn't look like he belongs in a gallery. The big guy, with scars on his knuckles, wore a dark hat even inside. They didn't look like they were discussing poetry." "Did you catch a name?" "The big guy." Spires called him Vico. "Sounds like a name for a man who breaks things for a living." I headed to a corner drugstore and used the payphone to call the brownstone. Fritz answered and put Wolfe on. I gave him the news about Finch solvents and Spias' new friend Vico. "Solvents?" Wolfe said, his voice gaining a sharp edge. "It is as I suspected. Mr. Finch is not just a conservator, he is a chemist of deception, and Vico is a known quantity in the more sordid corners of the antiquities trade. He is a procurer for private collectors who don't care about provenance. He provides the muscle for the exchange, so Spires finds the buyer, Vico provides the muscle, and Finch provides the fakes. It is a plausible trinity," Wolfe conceded. "But we are missing the catalyst. Why now? And why the Weymouth leaf? Provenance papers are key, Archie. They contain more than just history, they contain the validation for the entire Weymouth collection. I want you to find Eleanor Rossi. She is a specialist. If there is a hidden market for that leaf, she is the one who knows its destination." I tracked Eleanor Rossi to a small, cramped apartment near NYU. When I arrived, the door was slightly ajar. I didn't like the look of it. I pushed the door open with the toe of my shoe and stepped inside. The apartment had been not a professional job, but a frantic one. Books were scattered across the floor, and a desk drawer had been ripped out. I found Eleanor Rossi in the kitchen. She wasn't dead, but she was sitting on the floor holding an ice pack to her temple. She looked up at me, her sharp eyes clouded with pain and fury. "They took it," she whispered, "the private inventory list. The only thing that proves the leaf currently at the gallery is a forgery. Who took it?" I asked, kneeling beside her. "A man in a dark hat," she said. "He didn't say a word. He just hit me and took the folder. Mr. Goodwin, you must tell Mr. Wolfe. The auction is a fraud. They are selling a lie, and they are using my reputation to do it. I helped her to a chair and reached for the phone. The game was getting thick, and the ice was starting to fall in earnest. I had a conservator buying solvents, a developer meeting with thugs, and a scholar with a bruised head. As I waited for the line to the brownstone to connect, I looked out the window. The black sedan was parked right across the street, its headlights dimmed to a dull, menacing glow. I didn't mind. It's always easier to lead someone where you want them to go when they think they are the ones doing the following. I brought Eleanor Rossi back to the brownstone because leaving her in that ransacked apartment would have been like leaving a wounded bird in a cat show. The drizzle had transitioned into a fine, biting sleet that coated the windshield of the Heron in a layer of treacherous glass. When we entered the hallway, the house was quiet, save for the rhythmic, distant thud of the elevator. Wolfe was coming down from his afternoon session with the orchids, and he arrived in the office just as I was getting Elena settled into one of the yellow leather chairs. He looked at her bruised temple, then at me, and his mouth tightened into a thin line of profound internal annoyance. To Wolfe, a physical injury to a witness is not a tragedy, it is a messy complication that requires him to exert more energy than he had originally budgeted. "Archie," Wolfe said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate the pens on his desk, "I do not recall authorizing the use of this office as a triage station for the casualties of the antiquities trade. Why is this woman here, and why is she dripping on the rug?" "The lady was hit by a man in a dark hat who wanted her private files," I said, ignoring his grumbling as I took my seat. "And since those files were the only thing proving that Sterling Sons is about to auction off a piece of very expensive wallpaper, I thought you might want to have a word with her before the rest of the gallery staff decides to stop by and burn the house down. She's the one you called the specialist, remember?" Wolfe sat his chair, groaning as it accepted his weight. He looked at Elena with the clinical detachment of a man examining a flawed specimen. "Miss Rossi, you possess an inventory list. And yet you allowed yourself to be relieved of it in a manner that was both violent and, I suspect, entirely predictable. Why did you not seek sanctuary here sooner?" "I did not think they would move so fast," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of cold and fury. "The list is not just a ledger. It contains the chemical markers of the original Weymouth vellum. Without it, there is no way to scientifically discredit the forgery currently in the display case. They hit me and took it because they know the clock is ticking." Wolfe leaned back, his fingers interlaced over his middle. "Violence is the last refuge of the intellectually bankrupt, Miss Rossi. It is a tedious method. Archie, go to the kitchen, bring Miss Rossi some tea and tell Fritz to prepare a snack. And while you are there, check the center drawer of the sideboard." I stopped in my tracks. "The sideboard? Wolfe, it's 4 in the afternoon. Fritz is busy with the preliminary stages of the duck." "Check it," Wolfe repeated, his eyes fixed on a spot on the wall. I walked into the kitchen. Fritz was at the butcher block, his face pale and his hands surprisingly still. He didn't even look at me, he just pointed toward the dining room. I went to the heavy oak sideboard and opened the center drawer. The small, ornate silver inkella gift from a Montenegrin diplomat that Wolfe treated with a reverence usually reserved for beer and orchid shad been moved. It was no longer in the center, it had been pushed to the far left corner. In its original spot sat a small, white envelope. I didn't open it there. I took it back into the office and laid it on Wolfe's desk. He didn't touch it. He stared at it for a full minute, his yellow eyes turning into slits. "A subtle trespass," Wolfe whispered, and the tone of his voice made the hair on my neck stand up. "To enter this house, to bypass the locks, and to rearrange my personal effects, it is not a theft of property, Archie. It is a communication. It is meant to demonstrate that the brownstone sanctuary is a myth. Someone has been in this room while we were occupied. Nobody followed me in," I said, my hand instinctively checking the holster under my jacket, "and Fritz was in the basement for 10 minutes checking the wine inventory. But the front door was bolted. Whoever got in had a key or a very sophisticated set of tools. They didn't take anything, Wolfe. They just moved the inkwell." Wolfe took the envelope with his thumb and forefinger, treating it like it was contaminated. He opened it and pulled out a single slip of paper. He read it, then handed it to me. The note was typed on a high-grade bond paper, the kind you would find in a corporate executive's office. It said, "The Weymouth provenance is a closed chapter. Do not attempt to reopen the book. The next thing moved will not be silver. Thea threatening us in our own house, I said, feeling the heat rise in my neck. That takes a lot of nerve, Wolfe. Vico or Spireset doesn't matter who did it. They've crossed the line into our territory. It is more than nerve, Archie. It is desperation, Wolfe said. He stood up, which is a rare event when he isn't headed for the elevator or the dining room. He walked to the window and looked out at the sleet-covered street. The black sedan was still there, a dark, silent blotch against the white. They believe that by violating the sanctity of this house, they can force me to retreat. They are mistaken. When a man enters my home to threaten me, he has transitioned from a nuisance into a target. He has made the mistake of thinking my immobility is a sign of weakness. He turned back to me, his face a mask of cold, intellectual fury. Archie, call Saul Panzer. Tell him I have a job that requires his specific brand of invisibility. I want him to find where Vico sleeps, and I want you to go to Marcus Finch home. Do not ring the bell. Observe. If he is as nervous as you claim, he will lead you to the man who holds the files and the nerve. And Archie, after you find anyone else attempting to rearrange the furniture in this house, do not be polite. I looked at Elena, then at the envelope on the desk. The displacement of the inkwell was a small thing, but for Wolfe, it was a declaration of war. The Sterling Sun's gallery had brought its rot into our hallway, and now the walls of the brownstone were closing in. I grabbed my hat and my coat. The ice was still falling, and the city was getting slicker by the minute, but the temperature inside the office was even colder. As I stepped out into the drizzle, I didn't look at the sedan. I knew they were watching, and for the first time in this case, I wanted them to see exactly where I was going. I found Saul Panzer at a small diner on 10th Avenue, sheltered from the freezing rain that was currently turning Manhattan into a giant skating rink. Saul was nursing a cup of black coffee, looking as inconspicuous as a shadow in a coal mine. I didn't have to explain the situation. The look on my face told him that the subtle trespass had graduated into a direct insult to Wolfe's dignity. I handed him the address of the social club where Julian Spires spent his evenings and the description of the man the bartender called Vico. The big guy is the key, Saul, I said, sliding into the booth and signaling for a coffee I didn't really want. He's the one who handled Eleanor Rossi, and he's likely the one who had the gall to walk into the brownstone and move Wolfe's silver. Wolfe wants to know where he goes when he's not playing the heavy for the gallery staff. If he's the bridge between the buyer and the forgery, he's the one holding the line. If he was in the house, he's good, Saul said, his voice a steady rasp. But nobody is better than the man who knows the territory. He'll tail the sedan if it moves. You handle the chemist. If Finch is as brittle as you say, hell crack before the coffee gets cold. I left Saul to his vigil and drove the Heron toward a small, crumbling apartment building in Chelsea, where Marcus Finch lived among stacks of decaying journals and the smell of formaldehyde. I didn't park in front. I tucked the car around the corner and made my way to the fire escape. The ice made the metal rungs feel like greased glass, but I managed to reach the 3rd floor without alerting the neighborhood. I peered through the grime-streaked window into Finch's living room. It was a laboratory of desperation. Finch was there, hunched over a workbench, but he wasn't alone. Julian Spires was standing behind him, his expensive overcoat discarded on a chair, looking like a man who was watching his last hope burn down. On the table between them lay the original leaf from the Gutenberg, one with the lead-based pigment and Eleanor Rossi's stolen inventory list. "It's not working," Julian Finch said, his voice cracking with a high, thin reed of panic. "The chemical markers on the list, they are too specific. Even with my best solvents, I can't replicate the exact oxidation rate of the Weymouth vellum. If a real expert looks at the facsimile during the auction tomorrow, they'll see the discrepancy in the light absorption. We're selling a ghost. We are selling a multi-million-dollar asset," Spires snapped, his face twisted into a mask of cold, sharp ambition. "The buyer is already in town. Vico is pressing me for a delivery date. If you can't make that facsimile perfect, those provenance papers are just expensive scrap paper. Do it again. Use the concentrated wash. If I use any more wash, the ink will bleed into the fibers," Finch pleaded. "I've already moved the original out of the gallery. If Pendergast decides to do a midnight check, we're finished. We have no more room to move." I pulled back from the window, my breath hitching in the cold air. It was the confirmation Wolfe needed. Spires was the architect, Finch was the forger, and Vico was the muscle. But there was still a missing pieceth identity of the buyer, who had enough clout to make a man like Spires risk a prison cell. I climbed down the fire escape and headed for a payphone. I called the brownstone and got Wolfe on the line. I told him about the laboratory in Chelsea and the difficulty Finch was having with the chemical markers. "It is an elegant problem," Wolfe said, his voice sounding almost cheerful, which usually means he's about to lower the boom on someone. "They have the lock and they have the key, but they do not know how to turn it. Mr. Spires' greed has outpaced his intellect, a common failing among the ambitious. Archie, stay with them. If Vico arrives, follow the car. Saul is already in position at the other end. I want to know where that buyer is staying. And Archiafi, they attempt to destroy the original leaf, do not let them." I spent the next 3 hours huddled in the doorway of a laundromat across from Finch Building. At 10:30, the black sedan pulled up. Vico came out looking exactly like the nightmare Eleanor Rossi had described. He went inside and emerged 10 minutes later with Spires. They didn't have the leaf. Spires was carrying a small metal briefcase, holding it with a protective ferocity that told me the prize was inside. They drove north, toward the luxury hotels of Central Park South. I followed at a distance, the Heron's headlights dimmed to the legal minimum. They stopped before Pierre, and Vico stayed in the car while Spires went inside. I didn't have to follow him to the room. I watched the lobby and saw who met him by the elevators. It was Beatrice Vane. The majority shareholder wasn't just trying to cover up a scandal, she was the one orchestrating the sale. She wasn't protecting the gallery's reputation, she was liquidating its assets before an upcoming audit could expose her own financial mismanagement. It was a clean, professional betrayal. I drove back to the brownstone, the pieces finally clicking into place like the tumblers of a safe. I found Wolfe in the office, nursing a glass of beer and staring at the displaced inkwell. He didn't look up as I walked in. "It's a family affair, Wolfe," I said, tossing my hat onto the rack. "Vane is the buyer's agent, Spires is the middleman, Finch is the technician. They are selling the Weymouth Gutenberg to save their own bank accounts. And the black sedan?" Wolfe asked. "Still outside," I said, waiting for the word. Wolfe nodded, a slow, rhythmic movement of his massive head. "Then the pressure must be increased. If they believe they are close to a sale, they will become careless. Archie, call the New York Times. Ask Mr. Alcott in Town Hall. Tell him that a prominent member of Sterling Sons is about to make a spectacular announcement regarding a discovery in the Weymouth provenance. Let the rumors do the job the police still cannot handle. By morning, the closed chapter Mrs. Vane craves will be replaced by a clamor she cannot ignore. We shall see how her stability holds under the weight of public curiosity. The game was no longer about shadows. We were moving into the light, and I had a feeling that by the time the sun came up, Sterling Sons would have a very different sort of history to record. The morning sun didn't bother showing its face, leaving Manhattan trapped in a bruised purple light that made the ice on the sidewalks look like jagged teeth. Inside the brownstone, the atmosphere was even less inviting. Wolfe had skipped his usual pleasantries with Fritz and went straight to the desk, surrounded by a stack of morning papers that already carried the scent of the rumor ID planted the night before. The headline in the Times was tucked away on page 12, but it was exactly where the right people would see it. Weymouth Gutenberg discovery rumored Sterling Sons majority shareholder to address provenance findings. Wolfe sat in his oversized chair, his eyes moving over the print with a grim satisfaction. "The bait is underwater, Archie. Now we must ensure the fish feel the hook before they have time to spit it out. A panic thief is a clumsy thief, and Mrs. Vane has spent too many years being composed. She will find the sudden spotlight quite blinding. A woman who values stability above all else is easily unmoored by the threat of public scrutiny. The sedan is still out there," I said, peering through the slats of the Venetian blinds. "Vico looks like he stayed awake all night on a diet of bad coffee and malice. If we push too hard, he might decide to stop watching the door and start coming through it. He's not the type to wait for an invitation when his payday is on the line." "Let him come," Wolfe said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "A man who relies on his fists is at a severe disadvantage when the floor is being removed from beneath him. Archie, get Mrs. Beatrice Vane on the phone. I do not want her secretary, I want the woman herself. Tell her that I have had a very interesting conversation with a certain bookbinder in the West Village. regarding the chemical composition of 15th century vellum and the specific solvents required to mimic it. I did as I was told. It took 3 tries and a threat to call the district attorney before Vane finally picked up. Her voice was like a shard of dry, ice-smooth, cold, and capable of leaving a burn. I gave her Wolfe's message, word for word, and I could practically hear her heart rate spike through the receiver. She tried to sound bored, but there was a microscopic tremor in her tone that told me the ice was cracking. "Mr. Wolfe is overstepping his bounds," she said, her voice tight. "Sterling Son's internal affairs are not his concern. Whatever Pendergast told him is the delusion of a desperate man. They became his concern when someone swiped his silver," I told her, leaning back in my chair. "He's a man of very specific tastes, Mrs. Vane, and you've managed to spoil his afternoon. He'll see you tonight at 9 in his office. Bring Mr. Spires and Mr. Finch. If you don't, the next person calling you won't be a detective's assistant. It'll be a grand jury, with a very long list of questions about your recent hotel meetings." I hung up without waiting for a reply. Wolfe was already back to his book, but he wasn't reading, he was orchestrating. For the next 3 hours he had me making a series of timed interventions. I called Julian Spires and told him that Eleanor Rossi had regained consciousness and was currently being interviewed by a specialist in chemical markers. I called Marcus Finch and mentioned that the New York police were very interested in his recent purchases of specialty solvents and that a warrant for his lab was being drafted. By 2 o'clock, the phone in the office was ringing every 10 minutes. It was the sound of a conspiracy beginning to fray at the edges. Each suspect was being isolated, fed a different piece of the puzzle that suggested their partners had already turned. It was a classic Wolfe positioning, the psychological equivalent of a pincer movement. "Why the delay until tonight?" I asked, watching him adjust the orchid on his desk with a pair of silver tweezers. "We have them rattled now. We could pick them up before sundown if we called Cramer." "Rattled is not broken, Archie," Wolfe replied, his yellow eyes sharpening. "If we move now, they will have time to consult with counsel and craft a unified lie. By tonight, the suspense will have curdled their resolve. They will arrive here not as a team, but as a collection of frantic individuals, each looking for a way to throw the others to the wolves. Besides, I have a very specific revelation that requires the darkness of evening and the confines of this office to achieve its full effect." Saul Panzer checked in at 4. He had spent the day tracking Vico, and the report was exactly what Wolfe wanted to hear. Vico had made 3 stops at a private wharf in Brooklyn, the kind of place where things go out to sea and don't always come back. The buyer wasn't just a collector, they were a smuggler with a boat ready to sail, as soon as the facsimile was perfected and the exchange was made. "The boat is the exit strategy," I noted. "If they get that original leaf on board, it's gone forever. They won't get to the boat," Wolfe said. "They are too focused on the chemical markers. They believe the Weymouth fortune is within their grasp, and greed of that magnitude acts as a tether. Archie, ensure the office is prepared. I want the lighting low, the beer cold, and the red leather chair positioned for maximum psychological discomfort, and tell Eleanor Rossi to remain in the guest room until I signal. She is the final ghost that will haunt this gathering." I spent the rest of the afternoon preparing the stage. The brownstone felt like it was holding its breath, the heavy stone walls keeping the freezing city at bay while the pressure inside continued to rise. I checked my 38 and placed it in the desk drawer, not because I expected a shootout, but because a man like Vico doesn't go quietly into the night when he's cornered. As the clock ticked toward 9, the sleet began to drum against the windows again. One by one, the cars arrived. First Finch, looking like a man on the way to the gallows, then Spires, his bravado replaced by a twitching jaw, and finally Beatrice Vane, her marble mask cracked but still held together by sheer willpower. They were followed by a dark shadow I knew was Vico, lingering in the hallway like a bad omen. Wolfe sat behind his desk, a glass of beer in front of him, looking like an ancient judge about to deliver a verdict from which there was no appeal. He didn't look at them as they entered. He waited until they were seated, until the silence in the room was so thick it was a physical wait, before he finally closed his book and looked up. The positioning was over, the confrontation had begun. The office was illuminated by the soft, directional glow of the green-shaded lamps, casting long, dramatic shadows that seemed to reach toward the occupants of the room like accusing fingers. Wolfe sat behind his desk, his palms resting flat on the polished wood, looking like a monument of carved basalt. To his left, the red leather chair was occupied by Marcus Finch, who was currently sweating through his rumpled tweed jacket, his eyes darting toward the door, as if he expected the walls to collapse. Julian Spires sat to the right, his hands shoved deep into his pockets to hide their trembling, while Beatrice Vane occupied the center, her spine as rigid as a frozen spear. Behind them, leaning against the heavy oak door, was the man I knew as Vico, his dark hat pulled low, and his scarred knuckles resting on the framer's silent threat in the shadows. Wolfe began without a preamble, his voice a low, steady rumble that commanded the air. I have often observed that the most profound betrayals are not born of sudden impulse, but of a slow, corrosive erosion of character. You three have spent your lives among the relics of human achievement, yet you have seen fit to treat them as mere chips in a private game of larceny. The Weymouth Gutenberg was not just an archive, it was a testament to the dawn of the printed word. You have reduced it to a commodity of greed. We are not here for a sermon on bibliography, Mr. Wolfe, Beatrice Vane said, her voice brittle but sharp. You summoned us under threat of legal action and public scandal. If you have a point to make, I suggest you make it before I decide this charade has reached its limit. My time is far more valuable than your metaphors. The point, madam, is as sharp as the blade, Mr. Finch used to excise that leaf, Wolfe said, his eyes narrowing into yellow slits. You were the architect of this scheme. As the majority shareholder, you knew the gallery's financial vulnerabilities better than anyone, particularly the deficits caused by your own mismanagement of the endowment funds. You realized your term was ending, and an audit was inevitable. You decided to provide yourself with a retirement fund at the expense of the very legacy you were sworn to protect. You enlisted Mr. Spires for his connections to the illicit antiquities market, and Mr. Finch for the technical skill required to ensure the theft went unnoticed. Finch let out a whimpering sound, a high-pitched wheeze that broke the tension. I didn't want to do it. They promised me resources for my private lab. They said the Weymouth leaf was just a fragment, and that no one would ever know the difference once the facsimile was in place. It was supposed to be a victimless replacement. Be quiet, Marcus, Spires hissed, his face a mask of sweating silk. It is too late for silence, Mr. Spires, Wolfe said. The silence you attempted to enforce through intimidation has been broken. You believed that by trespassing in this house and moving my silver, you could demonstrate your reach. You were mistaken. You merely demonstrated your desperation. You have the original leaf, and you have Miss Ross's inventory list, yet you are still unable to verify the transaction. Why? Because the provenance is not a static document. It is a dynamic history, and you lack the intellectual capacity to turn the final tumbler of the mystery. We have the original, Spires snapped, finally losing his cool. It's in a safe place. The auction tomorrow will proceed with the facsimile, the buyer will pay, and the leaf will be long gone before Pendergast even thinks to look at the ink again. Time is a luxury you no longer possess, Wolfe said, leaning forward until the desk groaned. The specialist I mentioned on the phone is not a scholar. It is a reality you cannot escape. Archie, bring Miss Rossi down. I stood up and went to the hallway, signaling for Elena to descend. She walked into the office, her head high despite the bandage on her temple, looking like a ghost returned to haunt a crime scene. The reaction from the trio was instantaneous. Finch looked like he wanted to crawl under the rug. Spires went deathly pale, and Vane simply closed her eyes, her knuckles whitening on her handbag. You see, Wolfe continued, Miss Rossi did not record the chemical markers in her inventory list. She recorded a series of false indicators, designed to entrap anyone who might attempt to use her research for illicit purposes. She knew Sterling Sons was compromised long before Arthur Pendergast found his courage. The true markers are here, in her memory, and they are currently under the protection of this roof. Your buyer at the Pierre is waiting for a validation that does not exist. You have an original leaf you cannot sell and a facsimile that has already been exposed. Vico moved then, a sudden, heavy shift of his shoulders that drew my hand toward the desk drawer where my pal, 38, was waiting. Enough talk, he growled, his voice sounding like two stones grinding together. If she's the key, she comes with us. The boat in Brooklyn doesn't wait for a lecture from a man who can't even stand up to greet his guests. Mr. Vico, Wolfe said, not even turning his head to look at the man. You are a professional in a room full of amateurs, which is why I suspect you will appreciate the logistics of your current situation. Right now, Saul Panzer is standing on the Brooklyn dock with 2 members of the New York Police Department's Harbor Patrol. Your boat is being searched as a suspected vessel for smuggled antiquities. If you attempt to use force in this office, you will not be fleeing to a private island. You will be walking into a waiting room at Sing Sing. I have ensured that the exit you planned is now a cul-de-sac. The silence that followed was heavy and cold. Vico looked at the door, then at me, then at the massive, unmoving presence of Nero Wolfe. He was a man who understood when the odds had shifted, and he knew that my hand in the drawer wasn't there for a manicure. He didn't reach for a weapon, he simply stepped away from the door and put his hands in his pockets, his expression one of bored disgust. You were always a fool, Beatrice, Vico said, his voice flat. I told you the fat man was a mistake. You can't bribe a man who already thinks he owns the world. The mistake was thinking that history could be stolen like a purse, Wolfe said, reaching for his glass of beer. The Weymouth Gutenberg is safe because its truth is protected by the minds of those who respect it. You, however, are protected by nothing. Archie called Inspector Cramer. Tell him the discovery at Sterling Sons has been finalized, and tell him to bring the heavy-duty cuffs. We have a board member, a developer, a chemist, and a technician who are all in desperate need of a change of scenery. I reached for the phone, feeling the tension in the room snap like a dry twig. As I dialed the familiar number for homicide, I watched Beatrice Vane. She hadn't moved, but the light had gone out of her eyes. She looked like a queen who had just realized her palace was made of cards and the wind was starting to blow. Inspector Cramer arrived with the usual amount of clatter and a face the color of an overripe tomato. Head had to leave a precinct dinner to trek through the freezing slush, and he looked like he wanted to arrest the weather, the brownstone, and everyone inside it. He stood in the center of the office, his overcoat dripping onto the rug, and glared at Wolfe. All right, Wolfe, I've got 3 squads outside and a headache that won't quit. You told Goodwin you had the Weymouth case wrapped in a bow. Start talking before I decide this is all a dream and go back to my steak. My patience is as thin as that Bible paper you're so worried about. Wolfe didn't even look up from the glass of beer he was pouring. He waited for the foam to settle with the patience of a mountain before addressing the room. It is not a dream, Mr. Cramer, though it has the quality of a nightmare for the antiquities market. You are looking at a triumvirate of greed. Mrs. Vane provided the motive and the authority. Mr. Spires provided the market connections, and Mr. Finch provided the technical deception. It was a beautifully calibrated machine until they attempted to grease the wheels with the sanctity of my dining room. You're saying they all had a hand in it? Cramer asked, pulling a cigar from his pocket and chewing on the end of it. I thought this was just about some missing paper and a silver inkwell that got moved. It was a murder of provenance, Inspector, Wolfe said, finally meeting Cramer's eyes. Mrs. Vane discovered that her tenure at Sterling Sons was drawing to an end without the financial windfall she felt her status deserved. She realized that the Weymouth leaf, with its unique history, was a prize beyond value to the right private collector. But she couldn't just walk away. She needed a replacement to delay the discovery until she was safely beyond the reach of an audit. That is where Mr. Finch came in. I watched Marcus Finch. He was looking at his hands as if he'd never seen them before. Wolfe continued, his voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. The forgery was excellent, Mr. Cramer. Finch used genuine 15th century paper, harvested from the blank end sheets of less valuable volumes of the same period. He used iron gall ink, aged chemically to match the oxidation of the original. But he made one fundamental error of arrogance. He assumed that, because the original leaf was a maritime document, it would have been exposed to the salt air during its journey through the Napoleonic Wars. He added a microscopic trace of sodium chloride to his formula to mimic the patina of history. And, Cramer grunted, the Weymouth Gutenberg has not been near the sea in 300 years, Wolfe snapped, his voice ringing with a cold finality. It was kept in a landlocked estate in the Cotswolds until the 19th century, and then in the climate-controlled vaults of sterling suns. The original ink is as dry and salt-free as a desert bone. By adding that patina, Mr. Finch created a fingerprint of fraud that only a man of his specific chemical expertise would even think to include. It was the mark of a specialist trying too hard to be authentic, a masterpiece of overcorrection. Julian Spires shifted in his seat, his face a mask of sweating silk. That's just an opinion, Wolfe. You can't prove the leaf in the briefcase is the original just because of some salt theory. We haven't even opened it. I don't need to prove the salt, Mr. Spires, Wolfe said. I have the note you left in my silver inkwell. Rather, I have evidence of your attempt to use it as a weapon. When you and Mr. Vico entered this house to intimidate me, you believed you were demonstrating your power. In reality, you were providing me with the final link. The envelope you left was sealed with the same adhesive Mr. Finch uses for his restoration, sir, unique blend of rabbitskin glue and a synthetic resin he imports from Germany. It is a signature as clear as a name on a check. I had the residue analyzed while you were busy trying to decode Miss Ross's false cipher. Beatrice Vane finally spoke, her voice a hollow shell of its former authority. You were never supposed to be involved. Pendergast was supposed to just accept the loss. He was supposed to be the one who looked incompetent when the audit hit, not us. We had it all planned. A common failing of the conspirator, Wolfe remarked, is the belief that the victim will play the role assigned to them. Mr. Pendergast did not choose incompetence, he chose me, and I do not care for people who rearrange my furniture without an invitation. It is a discourtesy I find impossible to ignore. Cramer took the cigar out of his mouth and signaled his sergeants. All right, take them. I want the briefcase, the files, and I want that big guy in the hallway searched twice. If there's a boat in Brooklyn, I want to know who was waiting on it. And Goodwin, tell Fritz I am sorry about the rug. As the room cleared, the heavy tread of the officers echoing in the hallway, the office felt larger and colder. Eleanor Rossi stood near the bookshelf, her hand resting on a volume of Dante. She looked at Wolfe with a mix of awe and exhaustion. You knew about the salt before Mr. Goodwin even went to the gallery, didn't you? I suspected the impulse toward over-perfection, Wolfe said, closing his eyes. In my experience, the more someone tries to convince you of their honesty, the more salt they are rubbing into the wound. It is a liar's biological imperative. Archie shows Miss Rossi the guest room. I believe we have had enough history for one evening. I walked Elena to the stairs, watching as the police cars pulled away from the curb, their sirens muted by the falling sleet. The black sedan was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a precinct holding cell. When I returned to the office, Wolfe was staring at the silver inkwell, which was now back in its proper place. The salt? Wolfe? Really? I asked, sitting at my desk. That's a bit thin, even for you. You just wanted to show off. The salt was a deduction, Archie. The envelope blue was a fact. But in this room, a well-timed deduction is often more effective than a dozen facts. Now, if you are quite finished, I believe Fritz has managed to salvage the duck. It is a miracle I do not intend to waste. I grinned and started closing up the ledger for the night. The gallery was safe, the forger was caught, and Wolfe had his dignity back. It was a typical Tuesday on 35th Street, only with more dust and a lot less peace. The silence that followed the departure of Inspector Cramer and his entourage was a heavy, physical thing, the kind of quiet that only descends on the brownstone after the world has tried to kick the door down and failed. The air in the office still held the faint, lingering scent of Beatrice Vane's expensive perfume and the damp, metallic smell of the sleet that had clung to the officers' coats. I went around the room, straightening the chairs and moving the red leather one back those crucial 3 inches, returning the inner sanctum to its proper geometry. Wolfe hadn't moved. He was still behind his desk, but the book on Mesopotamian irrigation remained closed. He was watching the fire die down in the hearth, his features set in that mask of granite calm that usually means he's either contemplating the infinite or wondering if Fritz remembered to properly chill the beer for the nightcap. Well, I said, leaning against the edge of my desk and lighting a cigarette, the gallery still has its limestone facade, but it's short a majority shareholder, a lead developer, and a chemist. Arthur Pendergast called from the precinct. He wanted to thank you for saving the institution's soul, though I told him saving might be a strong word for what's left of a place that breeds that much treachery. He's sending over the balance of the fee tomorrow morning by messenger. I told him to make sure the messenger doesn't wear a dark hat or have a penchant for moving silver. Wolfe made a small sound in his throat, a grunt that served as his version of a chuckle. Gratitude from a man like Pendergast is a fleeting commodity, Archie. He is grateful now because the immediate threat of public disgrace and financial ruin has been averted. Tomorrow he will be resentful because he had to admit that his sanctuary was porous and his judgment of his colleagues was flawed. It is the standard trajectory of human appreciation when it is bought with the uncomfortable currency of the truth. Maybe, I said, but he's better off knowing that Weymouth Leaf was turning into a death warrant for anyone who got too close to it. It makes the actual theft look almost clean by comparison. At least a common thief just wants your wallet. These people wanted to liquidate history to cover up a bad balance sheet. It's a specialized kind of rot. Wolfe turned his head slowly, his eyes catching the last flicker of the firelight. There is no such thing as a clean theft, Archie, especially when the item stolen is a fragment of the collective intellect. Mrs. Vane did not view herself as a criminal. She viewed herself as an administrator of assets. To her, the Gutenberg was not a testament to the dawn of reason, it was a dormant investment. That is the true horror of the intellectual criminality. Remove humanity from the object, until all that remains is a series of strategic maneuvers and a price tag. They do not steal to possess, they steal to satisfy an appetite for power. Fritz appeared at the door, his face a picture of relief now that the invaders were gone, and his kitchen was once again his own. He announced dinner was finally ready to be served, nearly 2 hours behind schedule. Wolfe stood up, a process that always reminds me of a giant ship getting underway, and adjusted his waistcoat with a sharp, decisive tug. We moved into the dining room, where the table was set with the kind of precision that would make a diamond cutter weep. The smell of roasted duck and wild rice filled the room, a sharp, cleansing contrast to the dusty, clinical atmosphere of the Sterling Sun's gallery. As Wolfe carved the duck with the focus of a surgeon, he didn't speak. He respects food too much to interrupt it with conversation, especially when it has been delayed by the clumsiness of criminals. It wasn't until we were halfway through the meal, with a bottle of white wine between us, that he returned to the matter at hand. "You asked earlier if the salt was a thin deduction," Wolfe said, setting his fork down with a deliberate click. In this instance, the salt was the only thing that made sense. Mr. Finch is a man of vast technical knowledge but no imaginative empathy. He could not conceive of a world where a document remained inland and dry. He felt the need to add a sensory detail to convince himself of his own genius. It is a common failing of the forgeteau, add a lie so perfect that it becomes the very thing that exposes the deception. He was not defeated by my brilliance, Archie. He was defeated by his own lack of faith in the simplicity of the truth. He overreached because he did not trust the silence of the original. "Well, he's a genius in a cell tonight," I said, reaching for the wine. "And Eleanor Rossi is upstairs probably wondering if she should ever trust a gallery owner again." I have to admit, Wolfe, the bit about the false markers in her research was a nice touch. Did she really plan that? Or did you just give her the idea while I was out? "The truth needs no nudge," Archie, Wolfe said, his eyes roaming over the table with a flicker of satisfaction. "It only needs to be heard. Miss Rossi is a specialist. She understands that knowledge is a fortress. She merely provided the walls. I simply pointed out where the attackers had tripped over the moat. Now, if you are quite finished with your commentary, I believe Fritz has managed to salvage the endive salad. It is a miracle I do not intend to waste on further discussion of maritime larceny." I grinned and started closing the day in my head. The brownstone was quiet again. The intruders were gone, the secrets were out, and for once, the world outside West 35th Street seemed a little less messy, even if it was covered in ice. I walked out into the hall after dinner, leaving Wolfe to his history. The case was closed, the fee was earned, and for at least one night, the intellectual justice of Nero Wolfe had made the city feel a little bit more honest. I headed upstairs, thinking that tomorrow I might actually have time to get the Heron's oil changed. After the week we'd had, even a car deserved a little bit of maintenance without someone trying to follow it in a black sedan.